Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I'm your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is December 19th, 2018. It's almost over. Tonight, Bill C-76, known as the Electoral Modernization Act. When is electoral modernization? Wow, this is going to be a rough one. When electoral modernization is electoral restoration and the future. Hell of a start. One of the biggest planks in the 2015 Liberal election platform was quote-unquote electoral reform, which was a multi-faceted pledge. We know what happened with the part concerning electoral system. Sweet Festivus all. And Canadians will remember that. But the other part of the pledge is correcting the damage done by the Unfair Elections Act of the Harper regime. That process started in 2016 with the introduction of a bill to address this issue, though went absolutely nowhere until this past spring. In April of this year, Minister of Democratic Institutions Karina Gould introduced C-76. It consisted of all the measures in the original bill, C-33, that was paralyzed on the order paper, plus issues that had come to the fore since early 2016. The U.S. elections and the Brexit vote showed something previously unseen on the scale it was deployed. Messaging was no longer primary, data was. Motivated by cost-benefit analysis and efficiency, political and special interest entities had a new way to pinpoint what methods would work with specific target audiences. The effect continues to develop across the globe as controls on those effects race to catch up. At around 350 pages, including explanatory notes, Bill C-76 was highly detailed to counter the regressive law from the Harper era, drawing over 300 amendment proposals from the House of Commons. Progress was slow and acrimonious, moving to the Senate near the end of October. Amidst warnings of being too late to be implemented for the 2019 election with much more delay, conservative senators did all they could to make that prediction come true. Despite the delays, grandstanding, and misinformation programs, Bill C-76 received royal assent on the last day possible before winter recess. So it's back to the future for voters' rights and Elections Canada independence, and an open future for fighting external influence on Canada's elections. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the beginning. Now, I'm not talking about C-33 in 2016 because that would waste everybody's time, including mine. We're going to start with when Bill C-76 was brought forward. That was on the 30th of April, 2018. Now, this is from the bill itself with the preamble. On the 30th of April 2018, the Minister of Democratic Institutions introduced Bill C-76, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act and other acts, and to make certain consequential amendments, commonly called the Elections Modernization Act, and it was given first reading. Now, the idea of C-76 was to establish spending limits for third parties and political parties during a defined period before the election period of a general election, held on a day fixed under that act. So in English, as we're seeing now in Alberta with the quote-unquote pre-election spending period coming to an end, there were no rules about that federally. Bill C-76 seeks to establish that. It also establishes measures to increase transparency regarding the participation of third parties in the electoral process. Among other things it does in this regard, Bill C-76 would A, add reporting requirements for third parties engaging in partisan activities, partisan advertising, and election surveys to the reporting requirements for third parties engaging in election advertising. So it's not just the ad companies who work for the party. Now it's everybody who's playing partisan games. B, creates an obligation for third parties to open a separate bank account for expenses related to the matters referred to in the previous paragraph. C, creates an obligation for political parties and third parties to identify themselves in partisan advertising during the defined period before the election period. Notice it says an obligation. The enactment of Bill C-76 also amends to implement measures to reduce barriers to participation and increase accessibility. Among other things it does in that regard, Bill C-76 would A, establish a register of future electors in which Canadian citizens 14 to 17 years of age may consent to be included. B, broaden the application of accommodation measures to all persons with a disability, irrespective of its nature. C, create a financial incentive for registered parties and candidates to take steps during an election period. D, amends some of the rules regarding the treatment of candidates' expenses, including the rules related to child care expenses, expenses related to the care of a person with a disability, and, strangely enough, litigation expenses. E, amends the rules regarding the treatment of nomination contestants and leadership contestants' litigation expenses and personal expenses. F, allows Canadian Forces electors access to several methods of voting, while also adopting measures to ensure the integrity of the vote. G, removes limitations on public education and information activities conducted by the Chief Electoral Officer. H, removes two limitations on voting by non-resident electors: the requirement that they have been residing outside Canada for less than 5 consecutive years, and the requirement that they intend to return to Canada to resume residence in the future has been removed. It also extends voting hours on advanced polling days. Now, Bill C-69 also amends to modernize voting services, facilitate enforcement, and improve various aspects of the administration of elections and of political financing. Among other things that it does in this regard, C-76 limits election periods to a maximum of 50 days, removes administrative barriers in order to facilitate the hiring of election officers, authorizes the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration to provide the Chief Electoral Officer with information about permanent residents and foreign nationals for the purpose of updating the Register of Electors, removes the prohibition on the Chief Electoral Officer authorizing the Notice of Confirmation of Registration, commonly known as a voter information card, as ID. So once again, voter ID cards will become ID to vote. Replaces, in the context of voter ID, the option of attestation for residence with an option of vouching for identity in residence. So the vouch is back. Removes the requirement for electors' signatures during advance polls. Changes procedures for the closing of advance polls and allows for counting ballots from advance polls 1 hour before the regular polls close. It replaces the right or obligation to take an oath with the right or obligation to make a solemn declaration, and streamlines the various declarations that electors may have the right or obligation to make. It relocates the Commissioner of Canada Elections to within the office of the Chief Electoral Officer, and provides that the commissioner is to be appointed by the Chief Electoral Officer after consultation with the Director of Public Prosecutions for a non-renewable term of 10 years. This is a big deal because remember the Unfair Elections Act removed the commissioner from Elections Canada and put him inside the Justice Department. So no matter what election law had been broken, the government of the day could say, yeah, no, we're not going to pursue that. That is no longer valid. We're back to the way it used to be. Provide the Commissioner of Canada Elections with the authority to impose administrative monetary penalties for contraventions of provisions of this Act. Provide the Commissioner of Canada Elections with the authority to lay charges. Provide the Commissioner of Canada Elections with the power to apply for a court order requiring testimony or a written return. And it clarifies offenses relating to the publication of false statements, participation by non-Canadians in elections, including inducing electors to vote or refrain from voting, impersonation, and implements a number of measures to harmonize and streamline political financing, monitoring, and reporting. The last part of what it's about is the part that is the most unknown to most of the world. That is going forward in the digital era. But that's exactly what is in the bill. This bill that especially the Conservative Senate insisted will, fix an election. Since this government has come in, a charter statement accompanies all bills. That is law now, as it should be. Minister Gould tabled Bill C-76 on April 30th. On May 8th, the charter statement was tabled in the House. Now, a charter statement is intended to provide legal information to the public and Parliament on a bill's potential effects on rights and freedoms. It is not intended to be a comprehensive overview of all conceivable charter considerations. A charter statement is not a legal opinion on the constitutionality of a bill. Isn't that a handy little disclaimer? We're putting these out because we're so concerned about your rights, but if we want to just ignore that, yeah, we can. Must be cool to make the rules. Now, the Minister of Justice has examined Bill C-76 for consistency with the Charter pursuant to her obligation. This review involved consideration of the objectives and features of the bill. Now, Bill C-76 would amend the Canada Elections Act. For the rest of this, it will be called the CEA, and it governs elections to the House of Commons, sets out detailed procedures that give effect to the democratic rights protected by Section 3 of the Charter. Section 3 provides that every Canadian citizen has the right to vote in an election of members to the House of Commons. It protects the right of each citizen to play a meaningful role in the political life of the country. Now, if enacted, it would establish a comprehensive set of conditions for exercising the right to vote and the right to run as a candidate in a federal election. Conditions that, by their nature, potentially engage Section 3, as these conditions also regulate activities of individuals and associations that may fall within the broad interpretation of political expression. They potentially engage Sections 2B and 2D of the Charter. Now, 2B provides that everyone has freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, and includes freedom of the press and other media of communication. Section 2D provides that everyone has freedom of association. Now, there are clauses, such as Clause 223 to 238, 262, and 271 of Bill C-76, that would amend to introduce new pre-election spending limits in fixed state election years, which is what 2019 will be. State election years, political parties would be subject to a national spending limit on partisan advertising during a pre-election period, starting June 30th of that year and finishing at the commencement of the election period. Now, in 2019, this limit would be approximately $1.5 million. Third parties, individuals or groups who are not an electoral competitor, such as a candidate or a registered party, would be subject to a national spending limit and a spending limit per electoral district on partisan advertising, partisan activities, and election surveys during that same pre-election period. In 2019, this national limit would be approximately $1 million, with a limit of no more than close to $10,000 per electoral district. Now, partisan advertising or activity would be defined as messages or activity promoting or opposing a political party, its leader, a candidate, a leadership candidate, a nomination contestant, anything along those lines. And with nominations, generally in the pre-election period, there is the relevancy. Now, the current third-party spending limit, in the old legislation now, applies to partisan and issue advertising, taking a position on an issue with which a political party or candidate is associated. Now, under Clause 224 of the new bill, this election period spending limit would be increased to approximately $500,000 and extended to include funding of election surveys and partisan activities other than advertising, such as door-to-door canvassing. Of this, no more than close to $4,000 could be spent in any electoral district. Now, the limits on spending for advertisements and partisan activities engage Section 2B, freedom of expression, and potentially engage Section 2D, freedom of association. But the government says it's not a problem because these proposed spending limits support the consistency of the Charter. Statutory fixed dates for general elections provide a degree of predictability about the timing, particularly during majority governments. This enables wealthy political parties and third parties to spend significant amounts of money in the period leading up to the official election period. Spending limits in this pre-election period and in the election period itself enhance democratic values by promoting electoral fairness. Only a government could say that. Their purpose is to protect the right to meaningful participation of the entire electorate. Sure they do. They promote equality in the public debate during and immediately prior to an election by ensuring that wealthy individuals and entities cannot overwhelm the electoral discourse and drown out the voices of those with fewer resources. Third-party spending limits also protect the integrity of the financing regime applicable to candidates and parties. In other words, no citizens united. By promoting equality in the political debate and protecting the integrity of the financing regime, spending limits also ensure that voters have confidence in the process by reducing the perception that wealthy entities can dictate the outcome of an election. Oh, well, by all means, as long as we reduce the perception, all is well. Interesting choice of words. There's also new rules about who falls into what category. Clause 223 of Bill C-76 would require third parties spending more than $500 in partisan advertising, partisan activities, or election survey expenses in the pre-election period to register with Elections Canada. Third parties incurring $10,000 or more in the pre-election period would be required to appoint an auditor. Third parties incurring $10,000 or more in total during the pre-election period or receiving $10,000 or more in contributions during that period would be required to file interim reports on contributions received and money spent in respect of these items. Reports would need to identify the name and address of those contributing over $200 for those purposes. A third party that was unable to identify which contributions were received for these purposes would be required to disclose all contributions of more than $200 that were made to that third party subsequent to the previous general election. Now, this is a big thing that the Conservatives really shit their pants over. They didn't just want reporting for third parties in the pre-election period, etc. This law goes back to after the last election. This is a permanent record regime now with reporting responsibilities. Enforceable. So now you're starting to understand why the Conservatives are so upset. Clause 223 would also require third parties to self-identify on pre-election partisan advertisements. Currently, third parties must disclose those contributions made for the purpose of funding election advertising during the 6 months prior to an election. Clause 234 would require all registered third parties to report on contributions received since the last election for the purposes of partisan advertising, partisan activity, election advertising, and election surveys. Again, the identification of those contributing over $200. This charter statement says these requirements engage Section 2B and potentially Section 2D. Yes, they do. But, again, just like previously, don't worry about it. These requirements enhance the transparency and accountability of the electoral process. They ensure the proper implementation and enforcement of the spending limits and provide important information to voters as to who is sponsoring advertising and activities intended to influence their vote. The proposals would encourage careful record-keeping and compliance, and would encourage third parties to be aware of the purpose for which they receive donations and how they use the money they receive. So, is any reasonable person mad yet? Is there anything you're hearing that is just outrageous, shouldn't be there? If no, you're not a member of the CPC. Foreign funding. Clauses 223, 225, and 232 would extend the current prohibition on third parties in Canada using foreign funds for advertising during the election period. The proposed new prohibition would prevent third parties from using foreign funds for advertising in the pre-election period and for election surveys and other partisan activities such as door-to-door canvassing. Foreign third parties would be prohibited from incurring expenses in the pre-election period for advertising and for election surveys and other partisan activities. Under Clause 225, foreign third parties would no longer be permitted to incur election advertising expenses. Clause 190 would prohibit broadcasting entities and online platforms from knowingly selling advertising space to foreign individuals and entities who are using the advertising to unduly influence an elector to vote or refrain from voting, or to vote or refrain from voting for a particular candidate or party. I don't have a problem with that. And again, these requirements engage Section 2B and Section 2D. Well, yes, they certainly do. The Charter Statement defends it by saying, participation in Canadian elections should be restricted to people and organizations that have a legitimate interest and stake in the future of the country. Limits on foreign funding enhance the Canadians' perception of the integrity of the electoral system by helping to ensure that the debate during elections reflects the priorities of those with a direct interest in the outcome of the election. Okay, I'm good with that. About non-resident voting, Clauses 7 and 151 to 156 of Bill C-76 would remove provisions currently in place that prevent certain non-resident citizens from voting. Currently, Canadian citizens residing outside of Canada cannot vote if they have been away for more than 5 consecutive years or if they do not intend to return to Canada as a resident. Exceptions are made for Canadian Forces members, federal and provincial public servants, and employees of certain international organizations who are posted abroad. Interpret that any way you like. Excluding citizens from voting when they do not meet the above requirements engages Section 3 of the Charter, which is the right to vote and the right to run as a candidate. The proposal promotes the right to vote by removing certain residency-based limitations. Into the vouching, a lot of clauses of C-76 would permit electors to prove both their identity and their residence through a vouching process. Currently, electors have to prove their residence, but not their identity. Clause 93 of the bill would also permit the Chief Electoral Officer to authorize the Notice of Confirmation of Registration, also known as the Voter Identification Card, as a type of identification that can be used to prove an elector's identity or residence. Requiring a voter to provide acceptable identification before receiving a ballot potentially engages Section 3 of the Charter. Section 3 provides that every Canadian citizen has the right to vote in an election of members of the House of Commons and to be qualified for membership therein. And of course, the Charter Statement says, nothing to say here, we're making it better, not worse. Clause 357 of the bill would provide the Commissioner of Canada Elections the power to seek a court order to compel testimony in order to further penal investigations. The requirement to attend and submit the questions to further an investigation engages Section 7 of the Charter, as it deprives individuals of their liberty. Section 7 provides that any deprivation of life, liberty, and security of the person must be in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. This is a pretty easy one for the Charter Statement as well. Given the centrality of elections to our democracy and the importance of preserving public confidence in their integrity and validity, the Commissioner should have the necessary tools to swiftly and effectively investigate serious instances of alleged noncompliance with the Canada Elections Act. The ability to seek a court order to compel individuals to provide information in relation to investigations would allow the Commissioner to get to the bottom of such alleged instances in a timely and effective manner. The power could not be used in respect of suspects in the investigation. Neither the testimony nor evidence derived from that could be used in further proceedings against the individual being compelled to testify. A judge would be required to authorize any order compelling testimony and could do so only where there were reasonable grounds to believe an offense had been committed and that the testimony would provide evidence of the offense. So, again, are you hearing much so far that sucks? Because I'm not. I'm not at all. Now, as said, it was introduced end of April. It was not an easy route through the House, to say the least. There wasn't a whole lot of attention paid to it by the corporate media for the first 4 or 5 months. Not that there was a whole lot to report on, but still. It started to pop up over the summer. The first thing I'm going to look at is, with all the investigations going on around the world about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and aggregate IQ and all that stuff. As I said in the opening, this is about electoral restoration and the future. The future was brought up, and it did get some attention. August 23rd, Joan Bryden, Canadian Press. Trudeau cabinet advised to do more to prevent digital media abuse in elections. Now, foreign and domestic actors will almost certainly abuse digital media to try to manipulate voters and undermine the integrity of Canada's next federal election. Experts are warning the Trudeau government. But while there's no silver bullet to prevent it, the government is being urged to implement at least 2 measures that experts say will help make Canadians less susceptible to manipulation. Require online political advertisements to be totally transparent, and require digital media to disclose every automated account or bot deployed to amplify political messages. Those are the simple things that we can begin to do to give people more transparency into how the digital platforms operate, said Ben Scott, a policy advisor on innovation in former U.S. President Barack Obama's administration. And even if it doesn't solve even a significant amount of the problem, it begins to change the way people think about digital media, and it sets the stage for more difficult interventions in the market regulations regarding things such as data privacy regulation and competition policy. Mr. Scott, now Policy and Advocacy Director for the Omidyar Network, yes, that Omidyar, a foundation that invests in supporting democratic institutions, was one of 3 experts invited to talk to Prime Minister Trudeau and his ministers during a cabinet retreat. The government sought the advice as it ponders ways to beef up Bill C-76, omnibus legislation introduced last spring and aimed, among other things, at preventing foreign interference in Canadian elections. Democratic Institutions Minister Karina Gould confirmed earlier that the government is particularly interested in doing more to ensure foreign money is not involved in efforts to influence Canadian voters. Mr. Scott doubted the government has time to tackle some of the bigger issues surrounding cyber threats before the next election in October 2019, but he said it could tackle the low-hanging fruit. First, he said every online political ad should be required to include a pop-up message that tells people, here's who paid for this ad, here's how much they spent, here's how many people it reached, and here's why you got it. In addition, Scott said digital media should be required to disclose all automated accounts. Now, Scott said the disaster that has befallen the American political system was accelerated by disinformation disseminated through digital media, accentuating extreme views and causing a rapid and destructive polarization in American political culture. The same phenomenon has occurred in different ways across the democratic world, and Canada will not be immune. In my view, it's not a question of whether it will happen in Canada. It will happen in Canada. The only question is, what will it look like, and how well will we be prepared to mitigate the negative effects? Now, on that score, Mr. Scott declined to say how Bill C-76 measures up, stressing that he's not an expert in Canadian election law. Nevertheless, he said, in my view, digital ad transparency and the labeling of automated accounts ought to be part of any comprehensive election reform package. Another expert consulted by the cabinet, UBC digital media professor Taylor Owen, agreed that C-76 could use some added muscle. The single thing they could do that would be most powerful would be more robust ad transparency, so that we know every political piece of content that's shown to us as an individual is identified. Who purchased it, who they targeted, how much they spent, and who it reached. If we have that, then at least we'll get transparency in the system so that after an election, we can hold actors accountable for who tried to influence whom. Professor Owen said he also believes that online giants like Facebook, Google, and Twitter should be made legally liable for the content they allow on their platforms. There is no reason, he argued, that digital media should be able to publish hate speech that is illegal in the non-digital world. Now, as we move through the progression of the bill, you're going to notice one pattern that we never saw in the Harper years. Government actually listens. But let's get serious. Now, the bill came out, like I said, end of April. The beginning of October, it took 5 months to get to committee. 5 months. October 10th, Hill Times, Sherelle Edelman. The Liberal government wants to push major online platforms to expand their political advertising registries north of the border as part of a package of more than 60 amendments it's proposing to its already sweeping Elections Modernization bill. When MPs return from the ridings on October 15th, a couple months ago, members of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, PROC, will begin line-by-line deliberation of Bill C-76. It's a big task, given the legislation's 245 pages with 100 pages of explanatory notes, further compounded by a whopping 340 proposed amendments. The majority of those changes come from, surprise, surprise, the opposition Conservatives, who have proposed roughly 250 changes to the bill. But the Liberals also submitted 66 amendments to their own bill, one of which aims to increase transparency around who is behind the political ads Canadians see on popular platforms such as Google and Facebook. So there we go. At the Cabinet retreat, the Cabinet is told that this is something you should consider. Well, as we get to amendment stage, there it is. What a surprise. That amendment, sponsored by PROC member Liberal MP Ruby Sahota, would add a requirement to the bill for online platforms that sell ad space to registered or eligible parties, registered associations, nomination contestants, and third parties to publish a registry of partisan and election advertising messages. The registry, which would be hosted by the platforms themselves, would have to include a copy of the ad and identify whoever authorized it, such as the registered or financial agent of the party or candidate. This information would have to be kept available for 5 years. Those placing the ads shall provide the owner or operator of the platform with all the information in the person's or group's control that the owner or operator needs in order to comply. To be captured under this proposal, the websites in question would have to draw an average of 3 million monthly visits from Canadian users in the year preceding the election or writ drop, if the site is mainly in English. If it's mainly available in French, that's 1 million visits. The threshold for sites that have content not mainly in either official language is much lower, with 100,000 average monthly visits required. The biggest social media and online platforms already have transparency initiatives around political advertising for the United States, according to information presented to PROC in the spring. Facebook gets 23 million Canadian visits per month, so they would definitely have to comply. Part of the bill's focus is to limit interference in Canadian elections by bad actors using social media. Facebook began enforcing its political ads policy in the spring and has a searchable archive that for 7 years displays the ad, the campaign budget associated with the ad, and the number and demographics of people who viewed the ad. Last year, Facebook began testing in Canada before it was rolled out in the U.S. Rob Lethern, Facebook's Director of Product Management, said during a July 24th press briefing, now all election-related or issue ads on Facebook and Instagram in the U.S. must be purely labeled, including a paid-for-by disclosure from the advertiser at the top of the ad. This helps ensure that people can see who's paying for the ad, which is especially important when the page name doesn't match the name of the company or person funding the ad. Twitter has an ads transparency center for certified U.S. political advertisers. And Google recently began disclosing in its annual transparency report where money is being spent on political advertising and by whom. Google requires that all U.S. election ads show a disclosure that identifies who has paid for the ad. For most ad formats, Google will automatically generate a paid-for by disclosure using the information provided during the verification process. Now, off the record, Facebook spokesperson has told the Hill Times that the company will be rolling out its archive globally, as it is currently in the U.S. only, but it does not have a date for the Canadian launch. In an email, a Google spokesperson said of this new amendment, "We are following the developments regarding the bill and any new compliance requirements that may arise as a result of the final legislation." So, yeah, we know about it. We're not saying anything. Twitter said they will be depending on their U.S. rollout pilot project and then make the necessary refinements, and then they will launch it to other markets, including Canada. Twitter said they support the intentions behind C-76, but that the company will need more time to complete our due diligence on the proposed changes and on how the platform will comply with them to host advertising. Now, among the government's other proposed changes, it wants to bar advocacy groups from ever being able to use money from foreign groups or individuals on partisan campaigns. The bill, as originally drafted, limited the ban to the weeks just before the election period and the campaign itself. But now the government is suggesting that it be open-ended. Now, after first reading and after second reading, to get it through committee, after a conservative filibuster that stretched over 3 committee meetings, on October 4th, PROC was finally able to nail down a schedule to debate the clauses of C-76 line by line. They will hammer out the details beginning at 4:30 p.m. on October 15th, after hearing from Minister Gould for an hour. The committee will meet throughout the week until no later than 1 p.m. on October 19th, at which point any remaining amendments will be deemed to have been moved and voted on. The Conservatives agreed to end their stalling after coming to an agreement with the Liberals to support an amendment to the bill that would increase the proposed Pre-Writ campaign spending from close to $1.5 million to close to $2 million. How interesting. That means the pre-election period could be up to 2 months long. Now, Conservative MP and Jason Kenney's hand-picked anti-choice replacement, Stephanie Cousy, her party's Democratic Institutions critic. It's a woman who's been an MP for all of 6 months, and she's the party's Democratic Institutions critic. Told the Hill Times last week she was feeling very hopeful and optimistic about the path forward, but that as the official opposition, the Conservatives want to feel absolutely certain that Canadians in our electoral processes are protected from foreign influences, and we're not necessarily convinced as of yet that the pieces are in place to do that. The number of Liberal amendments to their own legislation usually points to a flawed bill, said New Democrat Member of Parliament Nathan Cullen, his party's Democratic Reform critic. It's amazing that it needs this much repair if they took this long to write it. Well, in addition to the lengthy number of Conservative amendments and Liberal amendments, the NDP submitted 29, the Green Party 17, the Bloc Québécois 2. Now, the NDP, for instance, wants to amend the bill so privacy laws would cover political parties. We'll get to more of that as we go along. So that's how many different things were found to be up for debate, I guess we should say, when you look at it that way. October 22nd, which is after the limited time by calendar, line by line, of C-76, from Rachel Aiello, CTV. This week, the House is set to debate the considerably amended key government elections bill before voting on it and likely passing it on to the Senate. With a year left before the next federal election, time is of the essence if the Liberals want to have many of their new foreign spending and political advertising regimes implemented in time. Last week, MPs on the Procedure and House Affairs Committee passed a spate of amendments to the bill. It was retabled with these amendments this week by committee chair and Liberal MP Larry Bagnall. He thanked all committee members for their contributions and said the bill will greatly improve and facilitate voting and the electoral system in a dramatically changing digital world. Notice how that digital world thing is working into every statement now. Government House Leader Bartis Chagger said on Thursday that priority will be given to report stage and third reading debate of the legislation once Bill C-76 was back from committee. After a nearly week-long clause-by-clause of the bill, a total of 70 amendments were taken. All 52 of the Liberal amendments that were moved were passed. What a surprise. But, as we read previously, the one from Ruby Sahota was a lot harder on the digital platforms. 2 of the 26 NDP amendments were passed. Now, what were the big ones that made it in? Ruby Sahota's one, a ban on the use of foreign money being spent at any time, whether in an election period or not, to support a candidate's campaign or political party. This comes with a fine of 5 times the amount spent. Social networks will have to create a registry of all digital advertising, published and paid for by third parties, political parties, nominated and prospective candidates during the pre-writ and writ periods. New protections for the register of future electors, so it cannot be shared with the provincial electoral officers. Interesting. A specification that each polling station must contain a sufficient number of voting compartments so that each person who casts their ballot can do so privately and without interference or interruption. Again, just put more voting tables in a goddamn poll. Again, more Harper bullshit to save nickels and dimes. Among the New Democrats' proposed changes was one to make the regular voting day a Sunday and not Monday as at current law. It was defeated amid some division among the committee members, with some consideration for potentially studying the possibility of Sunday voting down the road. The NDP were also pushing for increased privacy requirements for political parties. Yeah, well, nice try. So with that many amendments proposed, it's pretty common to see next to none of them accepted, even from the government. So with 70 amendments, it's obvious that from when this bill was introduced in April until late October, some things had changed in the digital world and in the political world. All I can say is I'm glad there's a government who at least paid attention to it. They didn't just say it wasn't happening. Now, when it went to committee in the Senate in November, the bill got to the Senate. Of course, they have their own committees. Now, here's one from November 22nd, Joan Bryden, Canadian Press. A bill aimed at protecting Canadians from foreign attempts to influence how they vote is facing criticisms that it's too weak to do the job. Notice when C-78 started, it was about reversing all the voter suppression of the Unfair Elections Act. Now we're into November, and this bill is aimed at protecting Canadians from foreign attempts to influence how they vote. Publicly, the mission of the bill has changed. But Democratic Institutions Minister Karina Gould defended Bill C-76 on Wednesday, arguing it's just one means of deterring foreign interference in Canadian elections. Should a foreign entity attempt something on the scale of Russia's bid to manipulate the results from the 2016 American presidential election, Gould said that would be considered a matter of national security, and the full breadth of tools available to the federal government would be applied. She indicated those tools would include sanctions, the Criminal Code, and the Magnitsky Act, which empowers the government to freeze the assets and impose travel bans on corrupt foreign officials who have committed gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. Funny how they don't mention their powers they're giving to CSE and CSIS under C-59. We are trying to do what we can within the Elections Act to limit the ability of foreign actors to interfere in our elections and to deter any collusion between foreign actors and Canadians, but we still have the whole toolkit of the government available to us. It would become an issue of national security if it was on the same scale as in the United States, and I think we would act accordingly. However, some senators did not appear convinced. Yeah, I should clarify. As I mentioned in the previous article, committee would start off in the Senate with the minister, the first witness. That's always the way it goes. However, some senators did not appear to be convinced by the minister. Liberal Independent Senator Serge Joyal, the chair of the committee looking at this bill, expressed disappointment that the bill does not include a recommendation made unanimously by his committee last year, that election laws include strong prohibition and sufficient penal consequences to deter foreign interference, including seizure and forfeiture of assets of any foreign entity that attempts to influence a Canadian election. The administrative penalties that are in C-76 won't deter Russia or any other country to intervene in our election. We have to give a very strong signal, and this signal is not, unfortunately, in this bill. But Conservative Senator Claude Carignan expressed doubt that the bill will prevent foreign entities from using social media to spread fake news designed to influence the outcome of an election, exploit societal divisions, or sow chaos. aimed at undermining public trust in the electoral system. The minister acknowledged that it may well be impossible to prevent all foreign interference in elections. Still, she argued that this bill will help by requiring social media platforms to keep a registry disclosing who is spending money and how much they're spending on online political advertising. It would also undo the most controversial elements of the previous Conservative government's so-called Fair Elections Act. Okay, now we're going to start to get into the batshit part. Senator Denise Batters criticized the bill for restoring the ability to use what she called error-filled voter information cards to prove residency and restoring the ability of an individual to vouch for someone without proper ID. That could result in someone voting with no actual identification, only an information card which may have been printed and sent by Elections Canada in error. Gould countered that there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud in Canada and that it's more important to ensure that the most vulnerable Canadians, the elderly, Indigenous, and young people who are most likely not to have ID with proof of residency are not disenfranchised. Senator Batters also criticized the bill for allowing the Commissioner of Elections, who enforces election laws and investigates violations, to once again operate under the auspices of Elections Canada, the independent agency that administers election law. She suggested that would create a conflict of interest if, in the worst-case scenario, the chief electoral officer were to commit an offense. Wouldn't that really be the chief electoral officer investigating himself, deciding not to compel himself to testimony, and prosecuting himself? Minister Gould pointed out that the bill specifically spells out that the commissioner is independent of the chief electoral officer. But, again, as very few of the Conservative amendments got through, now it's in the Senate where the Conservatives no longer have a majority. Now it's all hands on deck. Now it starts with the misinformation big time. I don't really understand why. Well, like I said in the show description, they pulled every trick they could to try and delay it too long so it could not be in place for 2019. From Huffington Post, the Conservative cheerleader Althea Raj. More expats voting risks foreign meddling in elections, senators told. More Canadians living abroad should not be allowed to vote, a Senate committee heard Thursday, because hostile foreign governments might use their mail-in ballots to fraudulently influence federal elections. Speaking to the Senate's Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, expat U.S.-based journalist David Frum told his sister, Conservative Senator Linda Frum, and her colleagues, that while he doesn't fear the U.S. government will try to influence the Canadian election, he does believe thousands of Canadians who live in non-democratic societies could be used by the local governments there to try and influence the Canadian vote. Given the inevitable defect of ballot security outside of Canada, if you expand the population from the current few tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands or millions of ballots being cast outside of Canada, create an opportunity for governments that have very focused foreign policies interested in affecting other countries, Canada very much on that list, to use pressure on voters, maybe even fraud on their ballots, because those ballots your security measures will never keep pace with the interventions that foreign governments can imagine and can create. You will be creating opportunity for these governments to use Canadian elections as an opportunity to shape the Canadian governments they deal with. Holy Christ. Alex Jones material. Can you see the government of Qatar assigning civil servants to get Canadian expatriate ballots out of the mail and forge them and send them back? And for what? For 500 votes in 338 ridings? Be afraid. Expat voting is a problem whether people are outside of Canada for short periods of time or are long-term residents abroad, Mr. Frum added. But with short-term, you're dealing with a relatively small number of ballots that are probably not outcome-altering. So what they're specifically trying to get rid of is that 5-year provision that Harper was so horny to have in there. Frum's sister and Senator Denise Batters have been arguing for several weeks that the federal Liberals' election modernization bill, which extends expat voting to Canadians living outside Canada for more than 5 years, could open the floodgates for millions of citizens with no current connection to the country to pick the next government. Millions? There's 38 million people in the whole fucking country. Millions? And they're all eligible to vote, or they're all, of voting age? All of this is being done quietly, presented as technical changes with very little scrutiny by Parliament or the media, Linda Frum said in the Senate earlier this month. Let me repeat, we are potentially increasing the number of voters in the next Canadian election by more than the number of votes cast in the 4 Atlantic provinces in the 2015 election. Yeah, it's also theoretical that the Liberals will win all 338 ridings. What are you going to do about that? You're ridiculous. These are the people Harper put on our dime in the Senate. Her brother suggested Thursday that the question of expat voting and its consequences were not sufficiently considered during the bill's review. Hardening of the electoral system should be mission number 1 for every democratic country. A hostile foreign power is less likely to come at you with rockets and tanks than ever before, and more likely to come at you with these new means and to try to shape your government. This fear-mongering shit is just too much. Scott Jones, the head of the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity at CSE, told senators that while the risks of expat voting in places identified by senators as China, Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia are an obvious concern, his organization works with Elections Canada to verify that people on the other end of the computer registering for mail-in ballots are indeed who they say they are. That is one of the things we are always looking at when we do cybersecurity. Still, Jones did note that CSE believes Canada won't be immune from cyber threat activity against its elections. Now, the Conservatives have long been opposed to expanding the right of expats to vote, following an Ontario court ruling in 2014 that reversed the law barring those living outside Canada for more than 5 years from casting an absentee ballot. The Harper Conservatives introduced a bill that sought to limit that right of a potential number of 1.4 million. Now, that bill was later abandoned in committee. Winner all around. But the Conservatives successfully appealed that ruling at the Federal Court of Appeal. The case, known as Frank versus Canada, is now awaiting a Supreme Court decision. But the measures included in C-76 would make that decision moot by clearly restating the intentions of Parliament on the issue. In 2014, HuffPost studied the voting patterns of a group of special ballot voters, Canadian expats, convicts, and Canadian Forces members living abroad, who were all lumped together in one category, and found the Tories' effort to curb expat voting would hurt the Liberals. The data showed that in key urban ridings in the Greater Toronto Area, that group had overwhelmingly supported the Liberal Party during the 2011 election. On Wednesday, during this week of testimony, senators on the committee asked Elections Canada to tell them where, in what ridings, the 14,000 special ballot voters from the 2015 election had cast a ballot. Look at this, right here. Same article. David Frum. Millions of voters. You're going to fuck up your election. In 2015, there were 14,000 votes. Senator Batters aggressively questioned Stéphane Perreault, the chief electoral officer. She didn't get too far. While the Conservatives have raised the specter that millions of new voters may be added to the rolls in 2019, Chief Electoral Officer Perreault told HuffPo that, based on U.S. data, he estimates that only 30,000 additional Canadians will exercise their new right to vote. So from millions to 30,000 in 338 ridings. Senator Frum said she believes many parts of the bill show the government is dangerously naive about the potential of foreign influence in the electoral process. Her brother noted how the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom was financed by Russian money. What? Senator Frum and Senator Batters also took issue with the ability of a rich expat celebrity to mount a campaign outside of Canada to try and influence the election. Stephen Harper, we could be talking about a multi-millionaire celebrity rock star born in Canada, but who has lived in the U.S. for who knows how long. He hates pipelines. He decides to fund a free concert, an anti-pipeline rally at Madison Square Garden, and potentially influence thousands of non-resident Canadians to vote in a certain way in this election. Why aren't you concerned about that massive loophole in this bill? Obviously, Senator Batters is referring to Neil Young, I believe it would be safe to assume. Wow. Out of the blue and into the past. Perot told the committee that in such a scenario, the Canadian living abroad would be subject to the same third-party rules as those living inside Canada if he or she promotes a particular candidate or party. Holding a rock concert to lobby for a general issue, such as pipelines, might escape Elections Canada scrutiny. Ya figure, Senator Batshit? The guy works for Elections Canada. Ooh, what about a pipeline rally? Linda Frum believes these cases should be part of a third-party spending caps and that Canadian election activities should be legal only if they take place in Canada. Well, how are you going to prosecute them if they're outside Canada, you shithead? Elections Canada can only enforce elections law inside of Canada. Spending limits can only be monitored from inside Canada. Well, yeah, either we're serious about tackling this problem or not. Bill C-76 is not serious, and I'm disturbed that neither the Chief Electoral Officer nor the Commissioner of Elections has sounded the bell on this. Because maybe they look at the title on their door and it says, of Canada. But then, maybe perhaps the senator from Tel Aviv feels entitled to have overreach over governments all over the world. Seems to be a common theme. Senator Frum did get Perot to acknowledge that a part of the bill that explicitly allows a foreign government to declare its support for a political party or candidate, such as when U.S. President Bill Clinton in 1995 during the Quebec referendum said he had a preference for a united Canada. That is in the bill. The agreement between Frum and Perot was made on that point. Perot said, I think that foreign governments should keep out of Canadian elections. Obviously, Frum and her conservative colleagues are expected to table several amendments to the election bill. Although Perot warned time is running out to change a bill that he considers a vast improvement over the current law. Although it could undoubtedly be further improved, Bill C-76 is an essential reform, and I hope to see it become law soon. Time is critical. Implementing the bill requires changes to 20 of the various IT services that are used during an election, and there are considerable risks in introducing last-minute changes to these systems if there is not enough time to thoroughly test them before any electoral event. Elections Canada wants to begin in January to test the systems, with a field simulation in March or April to leave time for any adjustments. I urge you to keep these dates in mind as you study this important bill. I am worried that we won't have a bill or no law in a timely manner. After all that grandstanding and bullshitting and fear-mongering and dog-whistling and tossing dead cats around, since those people are no longer a majority of the Senate, everybody else seemed to get down to going through the bill and making amendments and deliberating and passing it. We move to December 11th. Joan Bryden again, Canadian Press. Election reform bill passed just in time to apply to 2019 vote. Legislation aimed at preventing foreign interference and constraining the influence of big money in Canadian elections has been approved by the Senate. Notice how all the voter suppression correction is no longer mentioned at all. Bill C-76 passed in the upper house on a vote of 54 to 31. That means the reforms will apply during next year's federal election campaign. The bill represents a first stab at grappling with the specter of social media being abused by bad actors, foreign or domestic, to manipulate election results, exacerbate societal divisions, amplify hate messages, or instill distrust in the electoral system. It comes in the wake of scandal over Russian interference in the last U.S. presidential contest and the misuse of personal information of millions of Facebook users during the UK's Brexit campaign. It will ban advocacy groups from ever using money from foreign entities to conduct partisan campaigns. And it will require online platforms such as Facebook and Google to create a registry of all digital advertisements placed by political parties or third parties during pre-writ and writ periods, and to ensure they remain visible to the public for 2 years. The bill requires political parties to put in place and publish policies designed to protect the privacy of Canadians whose personal information winds up in their massive voter databases. but there will be no requirement for independent monitoring or enforcement of those policies. Legislation also beefs up the powers of the Commissioner of Elections to investigate violations of election laws, including giving the Commissioner the power to compel testimony. Conservative senators proposed 4 amendments to the bill, but were all defeated. There were third parties involved with the development of C-76, as they were with C-33 that preceded it, and they were part of the reason C-33 never went there. Part of the reason C-33 was never moved up on the order paper is because there were cases going through federal court. 2 groups in particular, the Council of Canadians and the Canadian Federation of Students. On December 11th, the day the bill was passed in the Senate, the COC and the Canadian Federation of Students were celebrating Bill C-76 passing. The legal challenge to the Fair Elections Act, brought by the Council of Canadians and the Canadian Federation of Students, was a key front in the effort to repeal the voter suppression enacted by the former Harper government's Fair Elections Act. Students have been fighting against the voter suppression elements of the Fair Elections Act alongside the Council of Canadians since 2014, said Cody Zachariah, CFS National Chair. This is a hard-fought victory that will allow more students, seniors, and the homeless to exercise their right to vote in 2019. Bill C-76 repeals the main undemocratic elements of the Unfair Elections Act, which the COC and the CFS and others have organized to challenge politically and have fought in the courts. Restoring the voter information card as valid ID, restoring vouching, restoring the independence of the Commissioner of Elections, and ending the restrictions on Elections Canada to engage the public to educate them on voting. Bill C-76 gives the Commissioner of Canada Elections new investigative powers, including the ability to compel testimony, and makes increases to requirements for the protection of personal information by political parties, both of which the Council of Canadians called for in the wake of the 2011 robocalls election fraud scandal. And that's where this lawsuit started. In 2012, the COC supported a legal challenge by individual electors to the results of the 2011 federal election. Do you remember this? I do. The legal challenge did not overturn any 2011 election results. It did lead the federal court finding that there had been widespread election fraud. Namely, the federal court established that in the 2011 federal election, there was an orchestrated campaign of thousands of fraudulent, misleading calls that aimed to send people to the wrong polling stations, that it targeted non-conservative voters, that it had an effect on the results of that election, and that the likely source of the calls was the Conservative Party database. The Fair Elections Act itself was put forward on the pretext of addressing the robocall scandal, but it never really did. The Fair Elections Act, instead of addressing this voter suppression, stripped voting rights from hundreds of thousands of people. The COC, the CFS, Lead Now, and others led a campaign against the Fair Elections Act in 2014. The organizations challenged the bill in Parliament and in the streets from the moment of its introduction. While the Fair Elections Act ultimately passed and became law, the Council of Canadians and the Canadian Federation of Students continued to fight it, launching the legal challenge to the Act's violation of charter rights. That is the Frank versus Canada case that is before the Supreme Court now. There's a lot of comment about the Senate, always. Not just the stupidity when stuff like Brazeau and Duffy and Wallen and, I can't recall the Liberal senators' names who had to get the boot as well. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of effort to change the Senate to more what it's supposed to be instead of a patronage repository. I think the Senate is changing. Some people don't. Some people don't care. Think about the Senate even 5 years ago. See if a statement like this ever would have come out of it 5 years ago. This is from the Senate. Election law is set to be modernized before the next federal election. Legislation that brings Canada's election laws into the 21st century and makes it easier for Canadians has been passed into law after being adopted in the Senate. Bill C-76 has 4 main goals: to make the electoral process more accessible, more secure, and more transparent, as well to modernize the administration of elections. In November, senators heard from Chief Electoral Officer Stéphane Perreault and Commissioner of Canada Elections Yves Côté during a special hearing in the Red Chamber. The top 2 elections officials urged senators during a 2-hour committee of the whole meeting to adopt the legislation before rising for the winter break to ensure there was enough time to implement the changes ahead of the next federal election. The bill was adopted in the Senate with a technical amendment, and the House of Commons concurred with the amendment 3 days later. They go over the changes in the bill, nothing but positive, sticking to the facts, saying what will change, what will not, what is new, what is gone. We never used to see that from a conservative Senate. We would get a press release on Senate letterhead, but that's it. But as that statement came from the Senate, that is the official Senate release on the passage of Bill C-76, we still get CPC conservative noise outside of it. This is from iPolitics, Marco Vigliori, Tim Nemitz, December 14th, so a couple days after. Bill C-76, also known as the Elections Modernization Act, received royal assent shortly before the Senate adjourned for the holiday break. The formal and unassuming ceremony marking the bill's passage through both chambers of Parliament belies its frosty and often fractious reception by the major opposition parties in the House. The Conservatives in particular have accused the Liberals of using the bill to help rig the 2019 election. The federal Conservatives reiterated their opposition to the legislation after it received royal assent. In a statement, Tory MP Stephanie Cousy, the party's Democratic Institutions critic, said the Trudeau government had failed democracy by rushing through a partisan election bill without proper parliamentary consultation. In their haste to rig the next election in their favor, the Trudeau government will leave Canadians with a flawed electoral system less than a year before they cast their vote. Bill C-76 is a partisan elections bill that leaves Canada's democratic process wide open to foreign interference, and evidence suggests that this interference helped the Liberals defeat their opponents in several key ridings in the last election. Cousy accused the Prime Minister of making a mockery of Canada's democratic process by defeating efforts by the federal Conservatives to strengthen protections against foreign influence and interference in the elections bill. Really, where were they exactly? What bullshit. Chief Electoral Officer Stéphane Perreault had warned the Senate delays in passing Bill C-76 threatened to undermine preparations for the next vote. He also noted that the agency needs some time to communicate these changes to rules regulating third-party spending introduced in the bill, which will go into effect on June 30th, which, of course, would be the beginning of the Pre-Writ period. Perreault also noted that while the next election is set for October 21st, 2019, under federal fixed-date legislation, it is not binding. Therefore, Elections Canada needs to be prepared for a vote to be called at an earlier date. So now it's time for Elections Canada to get to work. So that's from the Conservatives, you know. We went through how things are returning to how they used to be, how there is a lot more evidence in record-keeping and limits on donations. But according to the Conservatives, this is leaving Canadians more vulnerable than they were without all this. This is rigging the vote. Okay. Same day, iPolitics. This is by Gillian Frank and Jamie Duong. Gillian Frank is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Virginia, and he is one of the named applicants in Frank versus Canada. Jamie Duong is an IT specialist at Cornell, born and grew up in Montreal, and is an applicant in Frank versus Canada. So what do they have to say about the passage of Bill C-76? It's been over 6 years since we, along with over 1 million other Canadian citizens, were quietly and administratively stripped of our right to vote from abroad. This disenfranchisement, which was neither debated in Parliament nor subject to open discussion, was effected under and defended by the former Conservative government of Stephen Harper. Our disenfranchisement was part of a larger global trend that has seen conservative political parties erode democratic institutions and voter rights in order to consolidate their own power. When the Canadian Senate approved Bill C-76 earlier this week, it undid some of the anti-democratic mischief enacted by the previous Conservative government. Bill C-76 will restore the voting rights of Canadians living abroad and strengthen democratic institutions domestically. We are grateful to the Liberal government for honoring their campaign promise to restore the right of expatriate Canadian citizens to vote. This legislation offers a ray of hope when democratic institutions are withering across the world. The Supreme Court of Canada is currently considering our voting rights case, Frank v. Canada. A decision in our favor is urgently necessary, as it will guarantee the rights of Canadian citizens residing abroad. Such a decision would put Canada in step with progressive democracies around the world. It will also protect us from cynical politicians who profit from ignorance and whip up resentment and fear for their own gain. More than anything, we hope that Bill C-76 and the debate over our right to vote act as a wake-up call about our impoverished civic language and everyday Canadians' tenuous connection to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We'll be the first to admit that this whole process was a long overdue civics lesson. But in debating our voting rights, which we should never had to do, we encountered troubling ideas about how democracy works. For example, social commentators and politicians repeatedly asked us if we pay taxes and told us that the basis of voting rights is paying taxes. Taxes are not, of course, the basis for voting rights, nor should they be. Many Canadians abroad pay taxes, just as many citizens residing in Canada don't. But this red herring is a red flag for how we talk about voting. Many Canadians don't actually understand the Charter, their own rights, and how democracy or their government function. More worrisome still is the question we repeatedly received from reporters: why do you want the right to vote? The question still leaves us gobsmacked. We know that voter turnouts are dangerously low, but are we so jaded about democracy that we no longer take voting rights and the desire to participate in elections as axiomatic? We have literally had to unpack on multiple occasions why we wanted the dignity of full citizenship and democratic representation. But perhaps these troubling questions can be taken as an opportunity to remind ourselves and each other about our core Canadian democratic values. Ultimately, our fight for voting rights has been premised on a few simple ideas. Section 3 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the right of all Canadian citizens to vote in a federal election. Further, the Canadian government passes laws that affect citizens no matter where they live. Therefore, Canadian citizens should be able to reach their government and hold politicians accountable no matter where they reside. Finally, voters should choose their government and not the opposite. I love that line. Voters should choose their government and not the opposite. But more than anything, during this journey, we have been struck by the generosity and thoughtfulness of Canadians at home and abroad. We have encountered so many other expat Canadians whose service to and unfaltering connection with Canada should be celebrated. We have heard from so many fellow citizens who shared our surprise and upset that not all Canadians could vote. And we are joined in our fight by a number of Canadian political parties, legal experts, and Canadian institutions committed to protecting and expanding our democracy. We hope that Bill C-76 is only the beginning of a collective effort to strengthen our democracy and connect Canadians to each other. In 2019, we will eagerly cast our ballots from abroad alongside our fellow Canadian citizens around the world. But today, we are celebrating by hoisting a pint of Canadian beer and toasting democracy. So how does that sound in comparison to what the Conservatives are saying? One of these things is not like the others. Now, as the election officials have said before committee, this bill is far from perfect, but it is a necessary and wanted and welcomed improvement over what we currently have, which apparently, if you're in the Conservative Party, means rigging the election and screwing Canadians. But there is all kinds of committees going on all the time. We talked about what happened with PROC in the House. The Ethics Committee has been having a long work over about Facebook and digital media and analytics and psychometrics, just like every other Western democracy who has witnessed the fuckery in the last 2 years. This was right after Bill C-76 became law. National Observer, Carl Meyer, December 14th. Watchdog expects outdated Canadian privacy laws to be a key election issue. Canada's Privacy Commissioner says that Trudeau's government changes to how elections are run will not lessen current risks to democratic processes or voter privacy. The Parliamentary Ethics Committee sided this week with the Commissioner's recommendation that political parties should be brought under federal privacy laws. That was far too late, however, to make it into the government's Elections Reform Bill, which received royal assent. Even so, Democratic Institutions Minister Karina Gould told National Observer she was open to further study by parliamentarians to assess how to bring political parties under a privacy regime. Now, of course, that was an amendment that the NDP proposed, and it was not accepted. A spokesperson for Privacy Commissioner Danielle Therrien said fixes are still possible before the next election. Where there is political will, change is certainly possible. but the bill maintains the current state of play around privacy, which largely exempts political parties, which all hold large amounts of Canadians' personal details, from any federal privacy legislation. C-76 does add a requirement that parties create and publish privacy policies, but it does not prescribe any standards for those policies or subject them to independent oversight. Parties are also not required to fit with laws like the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, which governs how personal information is collected and used in the private sector. Ensuring the privacy policies of political parties conform to privacy law was a key recommendation from the Privacy Commissioner at the Commons Committee on Procedure and House Affairs in June. There we go. That backed up what the NDP amendment was calling for. The Privacy Commissioner, before PROC in June, said that political parties should be subject to PIPEDA. He said at the time that each party's policy fell way short of globally accepted fair information principles. On December 11th, the Commons Committee on Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics released its final report on the misuse of social media data that it first encountered with the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, which affected 622,161 Canadians and millions more around the world. In the wake of global concern over the harvesting of vast amounts of personal information by online platforms like Facebook and Google, the committee said political parties and outside political groups should be subjected to PIPEDA. To implement that, the committee recommended beefing up the Privacy Commissioner's office with more resources to address modern privacy concerns and with new powers to conduct proactive audits, issue orders, and levy fines. The Commissioner's office, which confirmed its own investigation into Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal is still active, said it was pleased the committee had agreed with its assessment. The Facebook Cambridge Analytica matter and its impact on democracy has certainly highlighted the importance of this issue, said Senior Communications Advisor to the Commissioner, Toby Cohen. We also welcome the recommendation that either our office or Elections Canada be granted the mandate and authority to conduct proactive audits on political parties and political third parties regarding their privacy practices and to issue orders and levy fines. We stand ready to play an auditing role as soon as the necessary legislation is adopted. We will continue to press for reform of Canada's outdated privacy laws and expect this will be an important election issue. Now, Minister of Democratic Institutions Gould's Director of Communications, Amy Butcher, said the minister thanked the committee for its work and is reviewing the recommendations. She said, once again, C-76's inclusion of privacy policies was an important first step. Spokesperson Butcher said, Canadians are right to be concerned about their privacy and deserve to have their personal information protected. The minister has indicated that further study by parliamentarians would be beneficial to assess how political parties can be brought under a privacy regime. Now, this Ethics Committee investigation became a sprawling hunt across borders and oceans. It brought unexpected drama to parliamentary hearings in April when a Liberal MP pressed the two co-founders of Canadian political consultancy firm Aggregate IQ, who were under investigation by the UK Information Commissioner into whether the firm broke privacy laws. The MP, Vice Chair Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, stunned the room by saying that the chair of a UK committee, which had been investigating Brexit campaign spending, had been watching the proceedings online and had just texted him to reject what one of the witnesses said. The co-founders, Zachary Massingham and Jeff Sylvester, denied they were connected to Cambridge Analytica and said they were just hired to place ads. But Facebook suspended Aggregate IQ from its platform as the controversy continued to swirl. Months later, Erskine-Smith and two of his colleagues on the committee, Conservative MP and Chair of the committee Bob Zimmer, and New Democrat MP and Vice Chair Charlie Angus, joined a historic Grand Committee meeting in the United Kingdom involving reps from 9 countries, all investigating fake news and disinformation on Facebook. As its final act before releasing its report, the committee asked right-wing group Ontario Proud to hand over more information about its telemarketing activity and the funding it gets from outside the province. On the release of the committee report, Angus said the group had started the study to find out if Canadians' data had been taken into the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it dropped us into a very large and dark and bizarre world. In addition to the privacy recommendations, the committee called for new legislation to regulate social media platforms, requiring them to label content that's produced by bots, require rapid responses to reports of hate speech and other threats or harassment, identify and remove malicious and fraudulent accounts, and ban defamatory or fraudulent content. Now, the Elections Modernization Act requires online platforms to create a registry of political ads during the pre-writ period and the campaign and keep them publicly visible for 2 years. Meanwhile, the committee suggested an existing or new regulatory body should be given the mandate and authority to audit algorithms. Okay, we may be going a bit far here. Government auditing algorithms. Separately, it called for legislation to force social media platforms to quickly remove hate speech, disinformation, and other manifestly illegal content, or else face a financial penalty corresponding to the platform's dominance and significance. It called on the federal government to invest in research regarding the impacts of online disinformation and misinformation, and to study the long-term cognitive impacts of digital products offered by social platforms which create dependence. And it suggested PIPEDA itself be amended to add principles of data portability, or the right of users to download and use their own data from platforms, and to allow for more collaboration between the Competition Bureau and the Privacy Commissioner. The right to data portability is part of the European Union's GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which the committee referenced as part of several recommendations. It suggested the Canadian government adopt some similar measures. Good news, in my opinion. Ties in with other recent episodes of the Pierre, especially James Patrick and Neil Rawhauser on psychometrics. It's happening. It's happening whether you want it to or not, whether you've ever been on Facebook in your life. Don't worry, there's a ghost profile of you. Don't worry, they're just waiting for you. Whenever you want to drop by, we'll plug you in. Now, what exactly is PIPEDA? Well, let's talk a little bit about PIPEDA. It's not a new law. It's been around for a long time. It was completely outdated when it was updated. It needs to be updated again and expanded. Organizations covered by the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, must obtain an individual's consent when they collect, use, or disclose that individual's personal information. People have the right to access their personal information held by an organization. They have the right to challenge its accuracy. Personal information can only be used for the purposes for which it was collected. If an organization is going to use it for another purpose, they must obtain consent again. Individuals should also be assured that their information will be protected by appropriate safeguards. Now, PIPEDA applies to the collection, use, or disclosure of personal information in the course of a commercial activity. A commercial activity is defined as any particular transaction, act, or conduct, or any regular course of conduct that is of a commercial character, including the selling, bartering, or leasing of donor membership or other fundraising lists. Some organizations and/or activities may be exempt from PIPEDA in provinces that have privacy legislation similar. BC and Alberta have adopted private sector legislation deemed substantially similar to PIPEDA. As well, Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland and Labrador have adopted substantially similar legislation with respect to personal health information. Even in those provinces, PIPEDA continues to apply to all interprovincial and international transactions by all organizations subject to the Act in the course of their commercial activities, as well as to federally regulated organizations such as banks, telecommunications, and transportation companies. Under PIPEDA, personal information includes any factual or subjective information, recorded or not, about an identifiable individual. This includes information in any form, such as age, name, ID numbers, income, ethnic origin, or blood type, opinions, evaluations, comments, social status, or disciplinary actions, and employee files, credit records, loan records, medical records, existence of a dispute between a consumer and a merchant, your intentions, for example, to acquire goods or services or change jobs. These are all personal information under PIPEDA, and a lot of these are the targets for psychometrics and things like Cambridge Analytica. But however, There are some instances where PIPEDA does not apply. Some examples include, and the blah, 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 provincial governments and their agents, blah, 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 blah. Then you get to, unless they are engaging in commercial activities that are not central to their mandate and involve personal information. PIPEDA does not generally apply to not-for-profit and charity groups and political parties and associations. That has not been changed in any way, shape, or form under C-76. But not only PROC Committee, Senate Committee, but also the Ethics Committee in the House and the Senate will be sure to pick it up as well. Canada could be in a lot worse place as far as the civilian government being aware and being, to whatever degree, proactive about the threats moving forward. My opinion, if you remember back to when the Unfair Elections Act was pushed through by the Harper government, the common refrain against it, you heard from all parties, all groups, was how it was suppressing the ability to vote. The opposition was based that it was an affront against citizens. Now with Bill C-76, the NDP had some ideas how to make it stronger, but they weren't saying that it was fixing the election for the Liberals. They weren't saying that it was meant to destroy them. When the Conservatives brought in the Unfair Elections Act, every party said it was bad for citizens. The Liberals bring in C-76, and the Conservatives say it's bad for conservatives. Typical, true to form, but interesting. That's all I've got for C-76. There will be no The View Up Here next week on Wednesday, December 26th. However, between Christmas and New Year, at a date to yet be determined, there will be a Year in Review show with special guest Stanley Cohen. I will update as we set that up, or not. Stanley's one of those fantastic guests. Do you want to set it up? Do you want to lay it out? Or you just want to get together and talk? We'll see what happens. I would estimate maybe 28th, 29th, somewhere around there. We'll see. I have to talk to Mr. Cohen. Otherwise, happy holidays from The View Up Here. Whatever it is you celebrate or don't celebrate, we don't care. I agree with the basic message from supposedly all of them. Peace and goodwill. We'll talk to you once more before the end of the year. Thank you, everybody, for listening tonight to The View Up Here. Good night.